Welcome in, everybody, to the CFB Nation All-America podcast. My name is Bill Trocchi, senior editor at sportingnews.com, alongside Bill Bender, our lead college football writer at sportingnews.com. And again, Bill, we have a special guest on signing day 2.0 for 2023, John Garcia Jr., a fellow podcast host here in the CFB Nation Network. He is the CFB Nation State of Recruiting podcast host. Does it all by himself. Does one heck of a job. John, welcome in.
Good to be on with you guys. This has been a long time coming, and obviously it's a great time to combine our forces here to talk a little bit of the future of the sport, which you guys do so very well at the All-America pod. So happy to be here.
Thanks, man. Thanks. Yeah, it's great to have you. And let's get right into it. Signing day 2.0 is not as exciting as signing day 1.0, but there was still some excitement already in the day. We're recording about 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Nicholas Harbor, 5-star, is expected to announce probably during this podcast. We'll keep an eye on that one as we go. But the biggest fish, probably, or at least the biggest headline anyway, has already popped. Quarterback Jaden Rashada. He was looking at Arizona State after his decommitment post signing day from Florida, after his decommitment from Miami, and everyone's familiar with all of his background and with the NIL battle that went on between those two schools. And he was let out of his letter of intent that he signed in December with Florida. He poked around. He landed at Arizona State. John, what did you think about that? It looked like that might be a landing spot for him. What's your reaction to him going to the Sun Devils?
Yeah, I think this is a great fit. Obviously, West Coast kid, Northern California native, Pittsburgh, California, stand out over the last few varsity seasons. Really a great football player, which unfortunately gets lost in a lot of the drama around his recruitment. But look, Arizona State head coach, I was going to say offensive coordinator, Kenny Dillingham, formerly of Oregon as an OC, as well as Florida State. This is a long-standing relationship between he and Rashada, and Dillingham is sort of quickly built this reputation as not only this up-and-coming young offensive recruiter, but a quarterback developer. I think what he did in particular with Bo Nix in 2022 kind of vaulted him up the chain there, up the tier list, from a recruiting perception perspective, which is very important when you're talking about teenagers and developmental quarterbacks. So that long-standing relationship with Rashada was always going to play a factor after he asked out of that letter of intent from the Florida Gators. And sure enough, the first visit Rashada took after that point was to Arizona State to check out the new digs for Dillingham, who's an Arizona native now back home leading that rebuild there in Tempe. And I think it was really a hit the ground running kind of deal from a relationship perspective because they had so much familiarity. And then on top of it, look, there's a lot of family ties between the Rashada camp and ASU. His brother lives there. His dad played for ASU, I believe, in the late 90s. So there was a lot of familiarity with the school independent of Kenny Dillingham. So combining those two forces, I think, was really critical. And I think the timing was critical too. This kid's name's been kind of dragged through the mud for quite a while now. So I think there was an acceleration to this. He didn't have to sign today. He didn't have to be done with the process. We heard about many schools trying to get involved, from Cal to Colorado, maybe Washington at one point. But really, it came down to Arizona State and TCU, the two schools he spent visits with over the last 2 weekends. And as soon as we got closer to signing day, there was really an increased level of confidence from Kenny Dillingham's camp. He was even public about some of the hints with Rashada. So you just knew if it was to end sooner rather than later, it was going to benefit the Sun Devils. And I think this is a great spot, not only with that familiarity for Jaden, but also from a developmental standpoint. Drew Pine is there, the Notre Dame transfer, so he'll theoretically be able to sit and develop and learn from a guy who's been around. So that combined with Dillingham and that offense, I think will help Rashada ease into a spotlight role and kind of separate himself, distance himself from all the NIL drama that unfortunately is tied to his name right now.
Right. I think he's always going to be known as the $13 million man, right? And that's an unfortunate thing for him. It's tough to drag around, but he's going to a program that is lower profile than the SEC, lower profile than the Miami quarterback kind of thing. And like you said, Drew Pine's coming in from Notre Dame. He'll probably expect to start. Arizona State also returns Trenton Bourget, who started 5 games last year for him. They're bringing in BYU's backup quarterback from last year, Jacob Conover. A lot of quarterbacks. I don't think it's going to be under immediate pressure to perform. And like I said, Arizona State is not one of the programs that's going to get a ton of attention. I think he's good with not getting some attention after this summer and fall. So maybe that is a good spot for him.
Yeah, there's no doubt there was a fatigue. I think there was a fatigue even after the first signing day when we saw him at the Under Armour All-America week in Orlando. Yeah, Jaden was kind of over it already, and at that time there was a little bit of buzz about maybe some discourse between he and Florida, but at that point he was signed and just waiting to enroll. About a week later, obviously there was a lot more going on than we all realized. So yeah, I think this was accelerated by design from the Rashada side of things. He wants to just enroll at ASU and go play football, which at the end of the day is what he's best at, and the reason why so much of this stuff has kind of dusted up around his name. But look, this is a 6'4", highly productive California quarterback with as smooth throwing motion and as big an arm as almost any quarterback in this class. So he's an extremely valuable long-term developmental option at the quarterback position. So him being able to focus on that with someone he's familiar with in Kenny Dillingham, I think was a great situation for him to jump into. So in that regard, not surprised he ended it on signing day, even though he didn't have to.
Mm-hmm. Hey, Jim, we have breaking news, and we're going to let you flex your breaking news skills here now that there's a 5-star defensive end, Nicholas Harbor. He will let you tell us where he's committed, but he's following a couple other 5-stars that have gone to this school in recent years that have generated a lot of publicity. So I'll let you take it away.
Yeah, Nicholas Harbor, the freakiest 2-sport star in this class of 2023, 6'5", 233 pounds, is off the board to South Carolina. Shane Beamer and company doing a great job in the buzz department and capitalizing on the end of their season, of course, upsetting those couple of teams, Sporting Orange and Clemson and Tennessee. Just a huge grab for perception of South Carolina football and the ceiling of its recruiting prowess. I mean, this is a DC kid with no traditional ties to USC, or the Eastern USC, as they say, closer to home. And this really is a plant the flag moment. This was the most polarizing, closest battle to call going into signing day. Harbor had about a top 5 of South Carolina, Oregon, Michigan, Miami. Among the schools involved, Maryland, the home state school, was active in this recruitment, but really it came down to South Carolina and Oregon. And look, South Carolina built early buzz, got him on campus early, prioritized the football and track and field path that Harbor wants to take. But Oregon got the last visit. And when track and field and NIL and those factors pop up with the Ducks, they're hard to beat, especially when you get the last red carpet 48 hours in Eugene just a couple days ago over the weekend. So there was a ton of buzz coming out of the Oregon side of this thing, and I would say a confidence to go along with it from that Dan Lanning-led coaching staff. And why not? You got the Phil Knight factor, the NIL factor, and of course, from a track and field standpoint, for those who don't know, Oregon offers something very unique. I mean, it's arguably the best facility, not only in the country, but maybe the world when it comes to track and field. They hold the Olympic trials there. So if you are an aspirational Olympian like Harbor is, it's a big deal to pass it up. But that's exactly what happened today for South Carolina. So this is a huge banner deal. South Carolina, SEC track, no slouch on that side of the coin. But really, from a football standpoint, this is a banner national win that everybody kind of feels and ingests at South Carolina. Not something that happens every cycle there in Columbia. So a huge moment on an otherwise quiet national signing day will captivate the entire country. So now we'll see. Is this the best signee since, Jordan Birch, who has since hit the portal and ironically ended up at Oregon, or maybe a Jadeveon Clowney? I mean, could it be that big of a deal? I think we'll have to wait and see. Harbor is more raw of an athlete than polished like Clowney was, but whether he's a tight end or a defensive end, this is as big and freaky an athlete as there is in the country. Again, 6'5", 230, running 10.29 in the 100-meter dash. He just ran a personal best 6.64 in the 100 and the 60, faster than guys like Anthony Schwartz, who had some Olympic flirtations a couple years ago. So this is a truly unique get for Shane Beamer and the Gamecocks on a national scale.
Let's touch on two tight ends before we move into some, team discussions. I listened to your podcast yesterday, and you were talking about Georgia potentially scooping up two of the best tight ends in the country, Walker Lyons and Deuce Robinson. As of this recording, neither are at with the Bulldogs. Walker Lyons has committed to USC. Deuce Robinson, from what you understand, is not committing today. Let's fill us in on those two guys.
Yeah, so I think the optics of a Northern California explosive modern tight end recruit picking USC is not projecting as a big deal. But if you go into the buzz department, this was really all about Georgia with really Utah presenting as the best Pac-12 option among those holding buzz for Walker Lyons, who comes out of Folsom High School in Northern California. But here comes Lincoln Riley. There's always going to be a threat when he's involved, particularly with an offensive prospect. So this was kind of a quiet treading of water in second or third place for most of the recruiting process, but USC never wavered here. And obviously when you're trying to build a pass catcher pipeline here, that's a program that you assume is always going to be stable at quarterback and is always going to throw the football. So even though Walker Lyons, who's a member of the LDS Church, and he's going to take a mission for a couple years, when he's done, there's theoretically going to be a great quarterback passing situation in Los Angeles, whether it's somebody through the transfer portal like Lincoln Riley has mastered, or the 5-star they just signed in December in Malachi Nelson. So this is a really big pickup for USC down the stretch. We won't feel the impact on the field maybe until 24 or 25, but in principle, this is a big deal because all the buzz was with Georgia, and it's understandable, right? I mean, their best player is a tight end from Northern California right now in Brock Bowers, so you understood why there was so much buzz after Lyons took 2 visits to Georgia down the stretch of his recruitment. But yeah, big pickup for Lincoln Riley and a nice head-to-head win over Kirby Smart, which is obviously hard to come by these days.
And then the other tight end?
Yeah, Deuce Robinson, kind of like Nicholas Harbor. You talk about two sports being important. This is maybe a guy who has even more upside in his secondary sport of baseball. Maybe football is the secondary sport, which is impressive because he's the number 1 tight end in the country, I think, unanimously, no matter where you look at 6'6", 225 pounds. But yeah, he's got this Aaron Judge look to him, and a lot of baseball folks recently have been, upping the eyeball meters surrounding the Arizona native. He's in between recruiting visits at showcases, just showing that immense power and athleticism on both sides there on the baseball front. And there's now buzz saying that he could be a first rounder or maybe even a top 10 pick this summer during the MLB draft. And I think when that is potentially on the table, it's something you've got to explore to a high degree before finalizing really anything relative to your college plan. But on the college side of this, of course, he'd like to play football and baseball. Georgia, again, has positioned itself as perhaps the favorite. USC was the longtime favorite, the early favorite here. Oregon, Texas, Alabama have all tried to stay in this race. But there was a sense if he ended the process on the first, it would be Georgia's race to lose. Now that he's extending it, I think USC is right back in the picture, and maybe an Oregon can command a visit late in the process. That's something that Deuce wants to do but hasn't been able to do because of all the logistics and obligations when you're an elite baseball prospect this time of year. So a fascinating recruitment that will dip into the spring, and that's something we've seen with elite football recruits over the last couple years. Last year, it was Josh Connerly, the offensive lineman who didn't end up at Oregon until April. The year prior, it was JT Tuimoloau out of California out of Washington, before he ended up at Ohio State, where he made a huge impact this past year. So this is going to be most likely the recruitment that spills deepest into the spring. But for the number 1 tight end and or a first-round baseball projection, it's going to be worth it for all the colleges trying to stay in the mix. The only difference is there's no guarantee Robinson really ever plays college football, depending on how these next few months go. So that one will be fascinating in its own right.
John, when you look at the team rankings, I kind of used the phrase on the early signing day that it was an Alabama strikes back moment. They were able to, it seems like it always takes them a year, maybe a cycle, then they adjust, adapt, and they go right back to number one. So, what have they maybe figured out? Have they figured out the balance between the NIL, the transfer portal, and just the talent development in the NFL things that Nick Saban's going to continue to do?
Yeah, it's I think the reference of Alabama striking back is perfect, right? It seems like every year Alabama on the field doesn't live up to its own lofty, unreasonable expectations in this day and age. Recruiting is like the reciprocating factor there. And you see Nick Saban almost double down on the future. And that's certainly what it looked like with this class of 23. I think there was a couple items he benefited from. First of all, the in-state crop for the state of Alabama in the class of 23 was as good as we've ever seen, particularly on the defensive line, which was a huge need area for Alabama anyway. So he was able to really do damage right at home, landing a couple of Montgomery standouts in James Smith and Quay Rousseau, maybe the two best players in the state of Alabama. And then defensively, there was a lot of in-staters that they were able to win early and often for throughout this class. And I think elsewhere there was ambition. And I think that's the difference. When Alabama is seemingly more motivated and there's time in between any new NCAA regulations and for Nick Saban to adjust to them, like you mentioned, then that's where the ambition starts to really meet Nick Saban's history and track record. So going into the neighboring state of Georgia, even amid this Georgia mini dynasty or whatever we want to call it, and going out and grabbing maybe the two best prospects in the state of Georgia, including a legacy recruit in running back Justice Haynes, I think that was where we started to see kind of, okay, hey, this thing's tracking at a number one type level, and it might not be close thereafter. Sprinkle in a couple of big-time flips, whether it was defensive end Keon Keeley or quarterback Eli Holstein from Texas A&M. And then it was kind of this traditional, big, balanced Alabama recruiting class that felt more like a 2016, 2017 type of big volume type haul compared to what we've seen over the last few years, which was that sort of supplementary piece relative to the transfer portal where Bama's still trying to figure it all out simultaneously. I think the motivation, the time to adjust, and really until recently, the staff continuity, that was really, I think, a sleeper positive for Alabama in this class. There's not many years where Nick Saban has the same coordinators recruiting a couple cycles in a row. And up until the last few weeks, he did have that in place with Bill O'Brien and Pete Golding, respectively, before each has found new ventures. So I do think that was important for Alabama because the message at the top is always great from Saban, but there's usually some turnover thereafter before National Signing Day. And this time around, the last couple years, it didn't happen. And there was some staff continuity at Alabama, which is really the only thing that hasn't been consistent about the program.
One player Alabama did not get that they wanted was Arch Manning. Quarterback, of course, well-publicized recruitment. He ends up at Texas. He was number one recruit here and there, different services, different times, things like that. You were in charge of the SI 99 rankings. You put Dante Moore, quarterback who ended up at UCLA, as the number one player. Touch on Dante Moore and Arch Manning, what you saw those two guys, and maybe, where you think Moore can go as a true freshman at UCLA. There's no Dorian Thompson-Robinson anymore. And then what your expectations are for Arch Manning when he goes to Texas and he's got Quinn Ewers already in place.
Yeah, that's a great point. Look, this is splitting hairs here, right? Two top 10 prospects that have, ironically, a very similar both on-field resume and kind of a perception around their recruitment. I'll start with the recruitment. The development that these two guys are going to go experience is going to be minimal, meaning their floor is sky high. Both of them are 4-year varsity high school starters. Both of them are the focal points and elevators of their entire team and seemingly community simultaneously. Both of them scholarship offers since 8th, 9th grade in both cases here. So the pressure, the feel for both of these guys is sky high. Dante got the edge over Arch for us. One, because it's been more tangibly successful. Dante went to 3 straight state title games in the state of Michigan, won the last 2 of them, and put together a resume off the field that matched it. Every time we saw Dante Moore at work, he was the best player on the field or the best quarterback in the setting, even in what we're all kind of looking at as the year of the quarterback, right? It's not just these two. It's Nico Iamaleava. We just talked about Jaden Rashada. Jackson Arnold at Oklahoma is a stud. There's so many great quarterbacks. And in the year of the quarterback, whether it was the Elite 11, 7-on-7s, any other setting to sort of complement and pair with the Friday night evaluation, Dante Moore was the best one out there. And that's the one element we didn't get with Arch Manning. Of course, it was by design. We know there was a bubble that he was operating within, whether it was from a communication standpoint or a performance standpoint. He was all about his high school, which is great. I think the resumes are nearly identical on Friday nights, but when we got to see them live against other competitors, against great defenders, throwing to great receivers, Dante Moore was the best we saw this country every single time. So I think that gave us kind of the human instinct edge over an Arch Manning who we only saw on Friday nights, and we only saw him against relatively mediocre competition. I think that's an important element to bring up. Private school ball in New Orleans is not what the location and the NFL production per capita says about the Crescent City. So I do think that's an important factor to bring up. We've seen Dante do it with and against the best. We haven't seen Arch do it just yet. And in terms of their on-field prospects in year one, look, Dante Moore's got an opportunity to start. And I think that's part of the evaluation here. Chip Kelly, once Dante decommitted from Oregon, much due to Kenny Dillingham's departure to Arizona State, Chip Kelly was the first guy to get a visit and the first guy to really lock it in with Dante Moore. Notre Dame, Ohio State, a bunch of schools tried to circle back with Dante, but it was really about UCLA and that scheme from the jump. And I think kind of the move to the Big Ten, for a Michigan native is a big deal with Dante. So I think all of that factored in. And even though they've got a portal addition and some young talent in that quarterback room, Dante's the most talented the day he arrives there at Westwood, and he's already there as we speak. And then for Arch, as you mentioned, Quinn Ewers is there, Steve Sarkisian going into year 3. There's a lot of pressure here. I think this is the prove-it year for Texas, and it's always going to be tied to the quarterback position. We saw some good, some bad, some inconsistent, some consistent with Ewers in 2022. If he can build on that with the pressure of holding off an Arch Manning, then Steve Sarkisian looks like a genius. Ewers goes to the NFL, and Manning gets the keys in 2024. If Manning sees the field, conversely, I'm not sure what that means. If it's as simple as, hey, he beat out Quinn Ewers fair and square, then fine. Arch Manning should have been the number 1 prospect in the country. But if it's because of a lack of production or drama or injury or anything like that, maybe a slow start to the season, it could be bad news for basically all involved other than Manning's early experience. So I think both have the experience, the production, the size, and the wherewithal to make an impact in year 1. But if Manning has to make an impact, it's probably not great news for Texas and his head coach, Steve Sarkisian. So you wonder what that relationship becomes
you mentioned,
as the pressure intensifies.
Oh, sorry, mine cut out there. So you mentioned Dante Moore not going to Michigan. And then if you look at the next recruiting cycle, obviously Dylan Raiola decommitting from Ohio State made a lot of news. Michigan's been in on Jaden Davis. Where with Michigan and Ohio State and their quarterback pipelines, I know it's way early, but is the pressure on them to nail down one of those two, especially knowing that CJ Carr went to Notre Dame?
Yeah, right. A kid in their backyard, obviously a legacy prospect to the nth degree as the grandson of Lloyd Carr. I think there is pressure on Michigan there. It's recruiting hasn't been the backbone of the rise and sustainability of Michigan. It's been on the developmental side. But look, everybody understands that all of the perception begins at the quarterback position. And I think it's a big year for Harbaugh if he's there, and JJ McCarthy simultaneously, because you've now shown, hey, you can get to the playoff, but can you get over that hump? And a lot of folks are going to, unfortunately for JJ, tie that to the quarterback position. But if and when there's a threat to get back to the playoff, there's going to be a move made at some point. So establishing more talent in the quarterback room is going to be important. Michigan is not the biggest portal team. We've seen them lose more than they've gained there. They want to be a developmental school, and they've done a great job of it, but that position is still very much under scrutiny. So they've got to nail it in 24, because in 23, there was really an early exit from trying to land that elite quarterback. Once they missed out on a few guys early on, it seemed like Michigan turned the page to 2024. So, yeah, I do think you've got to land one of the elite arms in the class. Ohio State might be in a similar boat. We don't know what it looks like beyond C.J. Stroud. We know the names competing, but Ohio State had an up-and-down year recruiting the position. Again, that they were Dante Moore's dream school, but they didn't really circle back early enough after the Oregon decommitment to play a factor late in the game there. And then they lost a quarterback commitment in not Brock Purdy, but Brock Glenn, who ended up at Florida State. They did go out and flip Lincoln Keenholz from Washington, a big-time dual threat athlete. So we'll see how he develops. But yeah, there's been a lack of five-star type talent heading to Columbus at the quarterback position after this great run we've seen recently, from Justin Fields to C.J. Stroud. So I do think there's a bit more pressure on Ohio State overall, especially relative to their chief rival on the field, but it does trickle down to recruiting and the quarterback position. It feels like kind of a big year for Ryan Day in that regard, on top of everything else. So they've got to answer that question, especially after losing the number one recruit in the country, theoretically, in Dylan Raiola. There's really no buzz about them staying in that race here going forward. It's more so in the Nebraska, Georgia, USC front relative to Raiola. So Ohio State's got to circle the wagons in 2024 for sure. And at the quarterback position, it's not too early to talk about it, because these decisions are coming pretty fast and furious from those elite juniors.
All right, John, very good. Thank you very much for catching our audience up. Before you go, I always ask Bender a Trocchi trivia question, but I'm going to let you sit in on the Trocchi trivia question this week as well. I'll let Bill get the first crack at it. It's going to be an Arizona State themed question, since Jaden Rashada is headed to Arizona State next year. Since the Pac-10 became the Pac-12, that was 12 years ago. And if we throw out the pandemic year, there's been 11 seasons, not 12, 11 seasons since Arizona State's been competing in the Pac-12. How many bowl games has Arizona State been to in those 11 seasons? I mean, I know it's kind of a guess. I don't expect you to know exact, but let's see how close you can get. How many bowl games has Arizona State been to in the last, throwing out the pandemic, the last 11 years?
Well, John's the guest. I'll let you throw out the first guess.
Oh boy. Okay, here we go.
Oh man, I'll probably just play the averages here, and I'll say 5 of the last 11. It just hasn't felt great recently, so I'll assume that it was better earlier in the decade.
I would say 6, because I know, like, Graham, there were 3 or 4 there. It's between 4 and 6, so I'll go the high end and say 6.
I'm going to fool both of you. 9.
Oh.
Got us
9
on
out of 11. Now,
bias.
that was the point of the question. Like, they're actually, I mean, they haven't been good, but they've actually been over 500 more than you realize.
Right.
And now at Dillingham, I mean, they are a fascinating team to watch this fall, because Dillingham, he's in his 30s. He's never coached before. He's bringing in 25 transfers, and he has a 22-player high school class coming in. That's 47 new players for a 30-something-year-old first-time coach. So their floor and their ceiling are pretty far apart, I would imagine. So it's going to be fun to track Arizona State. John, we are definitely have you back as things progress through the summer, in any sort of developments, the Elite 11 camps, all the Rivals 5-star camp, All-Americas, whatever.
Kick rates in Ohio. Get John if you're ever down in Pickerington, Ohio. That's where I live, and there's a ton of 4- and 5-star talent rolling through here, as you know. So anytime you're here, I'll get the first beer.
Sounds good. And if you guys are in Miami, let me know. Likewise.
Yep.
Very good. All right. Well, thank you again, everybody, for joining. We will be back next week to discuss some quarterback situations around the country, the top 10 quarterbacks who passed on the NFL draft. I did a story on that last week at sportingnews.com. Also looking at where some of the class of 2020 quarterbacks have been and where they ended up, and the 5 stars, and who's transferred, and who's in the NFL, who's not. It's an interesting look back. I was scrolling through the names the other day, and I want to explore that next week as well. So thank you again, everybody, for listening, and we will see you next week on the CFB Nation All-America podcast.